All right, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome you all to our 21st Roundtable and our 76th event since 2022. Today, we are having a roundtable on politics and government in the Zhuangzi, and our invited discussants are Professors Chris Fraser from the University of Hong Kong, Mercedes Valmisa from Gettysburg College, and Stephen Walker from the University of Chicago. Our chair today is Wendy Zhongshu from the University of Macau. It's become a tradition here at 四海为学 to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience who wish to take part in future events, please email me. This event today will be 2 hours total, ending promptly at 11 a.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Wendy, I just want to say a few things about the 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices sometimes found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks and jerks or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you, or don't I know so much, and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be somewhat of a counterbalance for the negative attitudes often found in so-called blind reviews. While there is a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and space for speaking to one another in more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家 at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchanges by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So before introducing our chair, I want to once again thank everyone for being here, and especially for our speakers and our chair for doing the heavy lifting this morning. Our chair today is Wendy Zhongshu. She is currently a third-year PhD student in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Macau. Her dissertation focuses on how the philosophy of Laozi and Zhuangzi, especially the yin-yang correlation and wu-hua transformation of things, are adopted and reformulated in American science fictions to address their contemporary socio-political issues. Thank you very much for hosting today, Wendy. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Professor. Hello, everyone. I'm Wendy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone based on our different time zones. Uh, uh, so here is I'm very honored to chair today's roundtable. Here is today's format. We will have 3 rounds. In each round, one speaker will give a 10 minutes presentation, followed by 2 short discussions. First with one speaker for 8 minutes, and then with the other for 8 minutes. We will follow this format for all 3 speakers. After that, we will open the floor for questions and discussions with the audience for the remaining time. So as a chair, I will help keeping time and moderating the flow of our discussion. I make 2 notice boards. I will show this one when there is 1 minute left, and this one when time is up. So please check my window occasionally during your presentation. we will have three speakers. Before starting, I will introduce our three speakers based on the sequence of their presentation. Our first speaker is Professor Chris Fraser. Professor Chris Fraser is Hong and Suifeng Chan Professor in the School of Chinese at the University of Hong Kong. His most recent books are Zhuangzi, The Complete Writings, and Zhuangzi, Ways of Wandering the Way, both published by Oxford University Press. Our second speaker is Professor Mercedes Valmisa. Professor Valmisa is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Gettysburg College. Drawing on Chinese philosophy and other cross-cultural resources, she develops an account of agency that is relational, collective, and distributed, rather than centered on the self-contained individual. She is the author of Adapting a Chinese Philosophy of Action, published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and All Things Act, published by Oxford University Press but in 2025. And then our third speaker is Professor Stephen Walker. Professor Walker holds a PhD in philosophy of relations from the University of Chicago Divinity School. He teaches at the University of Chicago and DePaul University. His publications center on certain texts that typically gets called Taoist, especially the Zhuangzi and the Huainanzi. Exploring this tradition primarily as a systematic critique of the habits of thought and discussion that yield settled normative views and agendas. He is the co-editor with Brooke Zipporin of the recently published Routledge Companion to Chinese Philosophy. So these are the short bios for our speaker today. Now let's welcome to our first speaker, Professor Chris Fraser.
Chris, you're muted.
Thanks very much, Wendy. I'm going to turn on screen sharing
Okay,
and use a PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see. Okay, is it displayed?
yes,
Yeah.
we
Okay,
can.
good. So, what is a Zhuangist political outlook? The theoretical orientation of much discourse in the Zhuangzi kind of turns it away from general theories about fundamental first principles concerning familiar political issues, such as the justification of political authority or the scope of individual liberty. A characteristically Zhuangist response to those sorts of questions, I think, would be very deeply contextual rather than abstract and general. So you're not going to see a Zhuangist philosophy of politics that looks something like John Rawls, for instance. For related reasons, a Zhuangist politics doesn't correspond to any familiar political orientation or label. We can take three familiar political outlooks as examples. In various respects and contexts, I think anybody familiar with the Zhuangzi it will probably agree that a Zhuangist stance might, in some contexts, converge with a progressive or a liberal or a conservative stance regarding certain values and certain arguments in certain contexts. But unlike progressivism, a Zhuangist stance is not committed to and would probably make fun of a general ideal of continual progress. And unlike liberalism, it doesn't treat individual liberty as basic or central. And unlike conservatism, it's not committed to, and again, would probably poke fun at a policy of preferring the familiar to the unknown or the traditional to the novel. In my book, Late Classical Chinese Thought, I suggested that we can think of a Zhuangist politics as political Taoism, by which I meant a Taoist approach to social collective interaction in circumstances in which political authority is employed. So what I'll try to do today is say a little bit more about what a Zhuangist political Taoism might be. And I'll propose three main underlying commitments extracted from Zhuangzi writings that bear fairly directly on political relations. And I've got a list here of the passages that I think are especially crucial for that. Okay, so here we go. In a Zhuangist politics, I want to suggest the aim of political life is for communities, understood as groups of people, to follow Dao well, according to their De, taking into consideration both the community as a whole, constituted by a network of relations between its members, and each individual's course of life. The second point, for communities to follow Dao well, political power can be exercised on them only according to the inherent De of their members, which includes their values and ends. So ideally, political power will facilitate the values and projects of the people in a manner that merges so subtly with their inherent propensities that they don't really notice its presence. The main justification for this view is practical. It's the only approach, according to a number of Zhuangzi passages, that can be expected to succeed in attaining smooth shared performance of Dao and fulfilling the De of the community, such that the conduct of everyone in the community is responsive to Li, patterns, Xing, nature, Ming, their fate, and so on. Accordingly, the only legitimate ends of the state, as embodied in the ruler in his public political role, are those of the people themselves. That is, the state can't justifiably impose ends on people that don't align with their own ends. Now, to be sure, shared life in a political society may be among the ends that people share. And so the needs of such a society may place normative demands on them. But contrary to Hobbes, Hegel, Chinese legalism, and other schools of thought, in its relations with the people, the state does not constitute an entity with its own interests and ends on a par with those of the people themselves. It exists to respond to and foster the ends of the people. Okay, so let me say something about the background to those three characterizations. First, let's consider a very general Taoist orientation toward the nature of political life, okay? In a Zhuangist framework for understanding action, as I interpret it, agents apply their De, or powers of agency, to perform Dao, or paths of activity. And a success condition of such Dao is that the agent's course of action will flow or connect through or freely wander in a manner that fits its context. The means by which agents succeed in attaining that mode of action are variously described as in, according with, ing, responding to, flowing along with, shun, riding along with, cheng, and so on. The object of this according and responding is factual, uncontrollable patterns or things or matters that agents face, which are sometimes characterized as being inevitable, budai, or as ming, fate or factual circumstances, and can include their inherent disposition. So on this picture, action is regarded as inherently relational and responsive. It's prompted by and assessed in regard to the agent's relation to their circumstances, and adept action will respond to the circumstances in a manner that's smooth, flowing, and so forth. So I see that as the general picture. Okay, we take that picture and we apply it to political contexts. When we interact with other persons, the other side's Dao and De, which will include their identity, values, interests, needs, and so on, are among the patterns that we need to respond to. We seek to find a kind of balance or good fit between the two sides' paths. Normatively apt paths of activity in which political power is exercised are going to fit the same sort of criteria as individual agents' courses of actions. And so they're going to need to be responsive, smooth, free-flowing, and so on. And that's why the use of political power is of major interest in some Zhuangzi pericopes, because political authority places rulers in a special situation, a special sort of social relation in which clumsy, inept action on their part will be severely disruptive toward many other people's Dao. Now, a distinctive feature of a Zhuangist political orientation, and I think we can generalize and say a Taoist political orientation covering the Dao De Jing as well, is that it rejects the prevailing understanding of political aims and the means by which to achieve them. In the social and historical context in which most of this material was written, the prevailing view was that the primary function of political authority was to attain zhi, good order, control. This primary end would in turn enable pursuit of other ends, such as material sufficiency and state defense. And among rulers themselves, often these ends were extended into the view that successful rule lay in consolidating and expanding the power, wealth, and territory of the state. Rulers typically understood themselves to have political ambitions and interests apart from those of their people. A widely shared conception of how to govern is an interventionist model. One form of intervention is society-wide moral education aimed at persuading and training people to conform to the ruler's vision of good order. And another common technique was a system of judicially enforced incentives and disincentives to encourage and compel people. In both cases, you've got the ruler intervening in the people's lives to shape their thought and conduct to his ends. So he sets forth standards and norms and enforces obedience through a combination of persuasion, social pressure, and physical coercion. Now, a basic feature of the Zhuangist outlook is that it rejects this way of framing the ends of political society, and it rejects the accompanying interventionist approach. And a straightforward example is section 7.2, the second paragraph in Yingdi Wang, which mocks the idea that a ruler should issue guidelines, standards, norms, and measures such that people will obey and be reformed by them. It calls this sham virtue. To understand the stance that's presented in that paragraph, it's crucial to note the grounds for rejecting the prevailing view. They are that it's hopelessly ineffective. The text suggests that it runs contrary to overwhelming natural conditions. It's like trying to wade across the ocean, dig through a river, or make a mosquito carry a mountain. In some cases, it's dangerously disruptive, as it may interfere with robust existing dispositions or tried and true patterns of social interaction and organization. As another paragraph in the Zhuangzi says, it prevents people from settling peacefully into their actual nature and fate. So in effect, Zhuangzi writers reject the prevailing view because they see it as failing to respond effectively to the inherent patterns of things. Now, how would a competent ruler respond to the patterns? Well, among other points, he'd find ways to flow along with the people's and the community's inherent propensities. And that point's reflected in phrasing in the text about following along with what is self-so, making things pleased in themselves, and acting in a way as if it were the self-so workings of their nature. Ideally, the ruler's success subsumes his actions into the Tao of the community as a whole. So his achievements seem not to come from him, no one mentions his name, and people are unaware where the results that he brings about come from. The adept ruler is thought to attain these results by fully responding to the context without injecting any motives or ends of his own. He lets his mind wander in plainness without allowing any personal bias to affect his action. So section 7.4 describes him as standing in the immeasurable and wandering where there is nothing. That is, he has no particular position or viewpoint of his own. His actions and policies are driven wholly by the values, interests, and Tao of the people without aiming to shape, direct, or educate them. So the concluding point then is that, one last point. A concluding distinctive feature of the Zhuangist outlook is that unlike typical relations between individual agents, in which both sides Tao are balanced to determine an effective path by which to interact, in the exercise of political power, the state or the ruler doesn't have a legitimate Tao to follow apart from facilitating the Tao of the people. So, in other words, the Tao of the state or ruler is not to be balanced against those of the subjects of power. It's wholly a matter of complementing and facilitating their Tao. So, in effect, the ruler is not exerting agency as an individual in interacting with the people. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now we will have 2 8-minute discussions. First by Professor Valmisa and Professor Chris Fraser.
All right. All right. Thank you so much, Chris. So I really agree with most of what you have said on this model of political Taoism or Taoist political system, or and especially like the idea that the ruler does not have a Tao of their own that would be an individual agenda to impose on others, the idea of responsiveness, and the idea that political action has to follow that propensities that are already found in people and situations and so on. So what I wanted to ask you about, it might be like the only point in which I have a little disagreement. So to clarify whether there is a disagreement at all, because maybe I'm misunderstanding you, or how you see this issue. So it's about the issue of Li and Xin, all these patterns, propensities, and so on that you take to be natural, inherent, and kind of uncontrollable or non-negotiable, right? So on one hand, I completely agree that the Zhuangzi does not allow for like a sort of as unconstrained constructivism, in the sense that reality is not in our minds, that reality both enables and constrains the modes of engagement and the modes of interaction that we can have with it. But I also wonder whether the text pushes us towards more relaxed or more underdetermined or more kind of relational and dynamic understanding of those patterns themselves. I think like the whole of the inner chapters work towards destabilizing normativity and towards resisting all modes of fixed identity, any kind of fixed course of action, and so on, and suggests also that the very mode of engagement with things transforms what becomes salient and how we interact with it, right? That's how, I mean, I don't know how else to read in the Chulum, for example, that ontological ambiguity, right? That this is this, but it is also not this, or it's also that, right? And then the mode of action or the philosophy of action that follows from that. In that the sage proceeds not by selecting fixed distinctions, but really but not prioritizing any of them other than situationally and provisionally, right? By shifting between different distinctions, asserting now this, now that, depending on the context, the situation, and the goals, even when dealing with the very same set of patterns or conditions. So my question for you would be, how fixed do you take these patterns to be? Is there a Tien Li or some sort of Li out there that would be independent from our engagement with it? And this would be kind of a continuation of the conversation that I was having with Davide in another one of these roundtables a couple of weeks ago. So could we think of these patterns not as a single pre-given structure that underlies things and that is independent from engagement with it, but as a plurality of real but relationally emergent affordances and constraints that arise together with interaction with our modes of engagement, right? So that would be my personal preference. That's how I interpret these patterns in the Zhuangzi as being peculiarly unfixed, right? I think that matters a lot politically, and also that's why I'm bringing up this point, because I think that if we make these patterns to be something fixed, something natural, intrinsic to things, to the world, to situations, then we are reintroducing exactly the kind of stable normative order that the Zhuangzi is working so hard to destabilize, right? So if we allow for the lead to be fixed, then political responsiveness seems to be just accommodation or adjustment to a supposedly natural order, right? And this can be used to justify any type of social arrangement. And this is exactly the problem that I have with Guo Xian. And that's why I don't enjoy Guo Xian, because I read it that way. And his reading of Zhuangzi as justifying any kind of social arrangement by naturalizing it, by saying that is natural, that's how things are, right? So this would be a way of making actually Zhuangzi be politically conservative in that way, right? Of being able to justify some order just by calling it natural or intrinsic to things, right? Which makes it politically dangerous, I would say. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Yeah, and that's it.
Professor Fraser, you still have 4 minutes to respond to Professor
One
Valmisa.
minute. Well, that's a great question. So let's first acknowledge that in the Zhuangzi, in some of the privilegist literature, there probably is a voice there that's committed to the idea that Li are more or less fixed and stable. But in many other parts of the Zhuangzi that we're all familiar with, I think the suggestion is that Li is deeply variable, open to transformation, and typically it's going to be pluralist. So you're going to have a variety of different relevant for different agents. They're going to be changing in different contexts. And then even when you think you might have pinned them down, they're open to some sort of transformation and they might change yet more. So it's very deeply variable. That's one point. And then the other point to make, and we might not, maybe we'll have time to go into it later, is that I think that the Dao that you follow, it's pretty clear in Qi Wu Lun, is inherently a product of the interaction between your agency, your De, and the circumstances and the people around you, right? And so, as you said very nicely, it's extremely likely to evolve and shift over time, partly as a consequence of what you have previously done. So as you follow that Dao, it's going to be developing and changing. And unlike some people, I think that in the Zhuangzi, there isn't a rejection of the idea that by and large we follow Dao by making Shifei distinctions. I think there's a rejection of the idea that the Shifei distinctions can be generalized or pinned down or they're absolute. But when the cook cuts into the ox, he's still drawing a distinction between the ox and his own arm and leg, right? There's still a yes-no distinction in play. It's just that it's sort of radically up for grabs how that distinction is going to be fixed for a particular context. So I think that the Dao we follow are a product of the interaction between our agency, how we draw those distinctions in a particular context, and then the things that we can't control, which are out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I have time for saying something, Wendy.
Yes, still
Yeah.
1.5 minutes.
Half a minute.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, so there is not so much of a disagreement at all. I just thought when you're talking about the ruler cares for or has to respond to the Dao of the community, right? Of the group of people, it seemed to me that you were making communities have their own natural Dao, and you use a lot of terms like intrinsic natural and things like that. And I think that's what misled me into thinking where there was like a kind of a fixed, relatively stable way, certain tendencies that a community had, and the ruler had to like allow for that to
No, I think the
flourish, right?
community Dao would be dynamic. The fixed intrinsic things will be things like biological needs. You've got to eat and sleep. But the cultural side of it is going to be very dynamic.
All right, thank you so much.
Now I will hand it over to Professor Walker to have an 8 minutes discussion with Professor Fraser.
Hey, Chris, that was awesome. My curiosity focuses around two themes. And I'm not going to ask you a specific question so much as I want to hear what you have to say about these two themes in light of the general framework of Zhuangist politics that you've laid out. Theme number one, morality. And by morality, I mean, if I'm speaking classical Chinese, I basically mean ren yi, and maybe to some extent, shi, with the intensity of rightness. What do you see as the relationship? So, like topic one, what do you see as the relationship between this Zhuangist political approach or agenda or outlook or whatever, and moral structures, moral virtues? And in particular, I want to know, to what extent do you think that when the writers composed this material, they were advocating something that they themselves would classify as ren or yi or right? Like, to what extent is Zhuangist political leadership being presented as benevolent or righteous or good in some sense, absolute or otherwise? I'm really curious about that. So, topic number two, what are these guys supposed to be like exactly on a psychological level? It's kind of like the psychological and motivational question. I'm completely with you in terms of what the main priorities are of Zhuangist politics. Above all, responsiveness, like being able to take in other people's needs and fluid situational changes and respond instinctively and adeptly. I'm with you there. The Zhuangzi spends a lot of time talking about what it's like to be a person who does that stuff, and it often sounds pretty weird or even bizarre, like transhuman, going beyond commitments, wandering beyond the dust and grime, at least in cognate texts like Huainanzi, is very much a skill that people can develop for the sake of being effective in politics. And I'm wondering to what extent, I mean, I obviously have follow-up questions. So maybe why don't we just dive into the morality thing and the motivation thing? And if I have follow-ups, maybe we'll have time to pursue them.
Okay, thanks very much. I think the morality issue is slightly complicated. So the voices in the Zhuangzi that attract my interest want to reject morality as a guide to conduct, right? Because they think that it's insufficiently responsive. It's not contextually flexible enough. Okay, so they want to replace it. In effect, you might say there's a certain mainstream view out there by which Ren Yi is a reliable guide to following Dao. And these voices want to say, no, it's not, right? And then we've got those one or two passages in the Zhuangzi that say, norms of Ren and Yi were invented at one point as a guide for following Dao in one sort of context, and that context doesn't obtain anymore. So we should let go of those and just follow Dao directly. So those voices aren't taking Ren and Yi as a guide to conduct. It doesn't mean that what they're advocating we do will violate Ren and Yi in some way. In some cases, it might go beyond the call of Ren and Yi, but they just think you shouldn't be focusing on Ren and Yi as a guide to conduct. Now, the complication is, what if you're the ruler and a morality of Ren Yi is the dominant morality of the people in your state? They're all committed to that. And you think maybe that's not best, but that is, as a matter of fact, how things are. Then you're going to be taking that into consideration in responding to those groups of people. You might try to subtly guide them into looking at things a different way, but on the other hand, you're not supposed to intervene too much. So in cases like that, it would really require a very sort of subtle finesse to decide how you're going to apply or navigate around those standards in interacting with other people. Okay, so I'll leave that there and then move on to the second question. So what about this person who holds political power, right? Now, remember, we're not dealing with someone who has access to modern communication technology, and we're not dealing with someone who has to run for re-election in a few years. We're dealing with someone who's been born into a certain position of authority. And I think one thing that's interesting here is that the role of the ruler is going to be different depending on whether they're acting as a ruler or acting as themselves, right? So the ruler is still going to have personal relations with a circle of people around him. But the ruler's relation to the population at large, or the ruler's relation to public policy, is not a typical agent-to-agent relation. It's something rather different. In effect, in those relations, the ruler doesn't have a self anymore. So the ruler has, they have certain spheres of activity in which they're following their Dao as a person, but in their public-facing role as a ruler, it's as if they don't have a Dao as a person. They just have that Dao of rulership. And the Dao of rulership is to respond to all these people in a way that facilitates the continuing Dao of the community. So in our interaction as individuals, there's a certain sort of reciprocity in place. But when the ruler is interacting with the population, that reciprocity is quite different. The ruler can't have expectations from the people in the normal way that when we have them when we're dealing with people one-on-one. So what's the psychology of that person? I think that in that public-facing role, it's a very distinctive kind of psychology in which the self has really sort of been reduced significantly so that they're not acting for themselves in any way at all. And I think that's reflected in the rhetoric that we find in the texts. Now, that might seem very, very strange, but I think we can link that to the Zhuangzi's discussions of skill. Because in the actual performance of the skills, the agent has put themselves into a situation where they're just applying the responsive dispositions, including the capacities for extending and adapting those positions. They're just responding to a context that they've placed themselves into for the purposes of some end. Now, in the political realm, the end is not so clear, and the end is going to be adaptive. If it's swimming or if it's catching bugs or what have you, then the end is more well-defined. But in either case, there's a respect in which certain aspects of the self sort of are set aside or temporarily disappear from the picture for the purpose of doing this job. And so the ruler, in their public-facing role, I think, is often going to find themselves in that kind of situation. And that explains, we've got this rhetoric in my late classical book. I referred to it as the discourse on stillness. There's all this rhetoric about the ruler being still. And some of it has been applied by the legalists who correctly see that if the sort of system they have in mind exists, then the ruler should in fact not intervene whatsoever, but just allow that system to function. But there are other contexts where the people producing this rhetoric don't seem to be legalists. And they've got this rhetoric of stillness. And I think that's reinforcing this idea that in their public-facing role, the ruler is in effect not taking any action whatsoever, but just purely responding to needs as they arise. And someone could debate with them about whether or not that's the right approach, right? If part of what the ideal ruler is supposed to do is to facilitate things, then maybe sometimes they do need to take action.
I suppose there's a lot less than a minute left for follow-ups, but I want to express curiosity about how to apply this outlook in a society without monarchs, where you have to seek office instead of being born to it, because the prerequisite for ambition might just change the nature of the conversation in substantial ways.
Yeah. So there's a couple of fascinating books waiting to be written about that.
I'm game.
Thank you for the excellent discussions. And now I will hand the screen. Sorry, I muted myself. Now I will hand the screen to Professor Valmisa, and thank you for the wonderful discussion.
Awesome. Thank you, Wendy. I'm gonna share some notes as well. Here we go. You can see my screen. Yeah, okay. So it's just like an outline of the presentation. So Stephen invited me to read the inner chapters from the perspective of leadership. And this is something I haven't really done before. So I've never thought about it before in that way. But I have worked a lot on questions of agency and efficacy, dependency, and this kind of thing. And then I realized that kind of like the same stories, the same material that matters for agency also matters for leadership. So for today, I set myself 2 questions. The first one is, what do leaders look like in the Zhuangzi? And the second is, do these figures have any political import at all in the sense of organizing social relations and collective life? So starting with the first question, I just want to emphasize here that it's not about what qualities a leader should possess, but about how they act and how influence actually works, right? Because I'm less interested in, say, virtues and character traits or personality dispositions and so on, than in modes of interaction. And I think that's the case for the Zhuangzi as well, at least that's how I read it. So I have for you 3 Zhuangzi practices of leadership. Okay, so the first one is what we can call the paradox of influence. Only someone who doesn't seek to influence, guide, or control others can do so. And there's nothing mystical here. The more directly that one tries to manage or to shape others, the less effective that one becomes. This is simply just like in the Tao Te Ching, the moment that a path is set, it begins to undermine itself, right? It doesn't work. We see this repeatedly in the failures of Confucius and other Confucian figures in Zhuangzi. Again and again, they try to guide through fixed distinctions, through moral instruction, and they obtain very poor results. And by contrast, in chapter 5, we have a lot of criminals and amputees, physically deformed and socially deviant figures who become influential precisely because they fall outside structures of normality and normalization practices. They attract followers without wanting them. They teach without speaking. They affect others without even trying, right? Precisely because they aren't invested in managing others by reducing them to fixed behaviors or fixed functions, they become kind of these magnetic figures with a lot of capacity of influence. I think this also explains the death of Hundun at the end of the inner chapters, which is a story, to quote our friend Paul here. It's a parody of 3 failed sages, right? Or we may say 3 failed leaders. We have Hundun, who dies the moment that other rulers attempt to give him a fixed identity through deliberate intervention. This is the central danger of leadership in the Zhuangzi. Managerial imposition collapses the open field of possibilities. So the moment that influence becomes self-assertive, it hardens into coercion, and coercion naturally generates friction, tension, resistance, and harm, both for the governed and for the leader themselves. So influence can only emerge indirectly rather than through deliberate will and effort. And this also means that the Zhuangzi leader cannot be an individual figure of personal authority. Chapter 7 describes the discerning ruler as someone whose achievements cover the world, yet seem not to come from himself. There are transformations occurring everywhere, yet people do not become dependent upon the ruler because this is an almost anonymous figure, difficult to isolate as a source of action. We can summarize this first practice as the effective leader does not intentionally lead. Then we have the second practice that concerns the process of cultivation that makes an agent capable of non-coercive effective action. It tells us something about how the leader relates to themselves, to their own epistemic and doxastic states, which is the emptier, the more effective, right? The better. Empty of rigid goals, of mutually exclusive and fixed standards, empty of certainties, empty of valuations, and so on and so forth. This is one of the major reversals in the Zhuangzi because we normally assume that leaders inspire others precisely by having very strong values and very firm convictions. But here, this kind of commitment is considered to be narrow-minded and dogmatic. It reduces adaptive responsiveness and therefore makes one vulnerable both politically and existentially. In chapter 4, we have Yan Hui, who is told that he still needs to learn how to fly without wings. And similarly, the leader is the one who knows how to inspire and shape others without values, which means without getting trapped in any kind of rigid Shifei distinctions and judgments. Chapter 7 then praises the non-knowing of birds that avoid arrows precisely by flying high. And this is not just about self-preservation. We have Wang Fuji's commentary that captures the political dimension of this passage. He says, only one who doesn't delight in life and hate death, that's the Shefei judgments, can nurture life, can nurture the people. He who thinks he can control life and death pillages life. He who thinks he can control the people pillages the people. So this second practice claims that knowing what is right and what is wrong, what is so, what is not so, destroys responsiveness and produces harm. And we can summarize it then as the leader is empty of fixed commitments. And then finally, the third practice tells us how the leader relates to plurality outside themselves once that they are free from rigid commitments, or also what this emptiness that we have talked about with the self-cultivation process makes possible, which is a non-reductive relation to other beings. The leader allows things to be what they are by not reducing them to one another, which is not turning some things into masters and some things into slaves, some things into ends and some things into means. This is described as following the terrain of things, allowing each being to unfold according to its own shifting capacities, constraints, tendencies, and so on. Or in my favorite formulation, letting each thing enfold each. This is in Chulun, in chapter 2. So each thing has its own way of being workable, effective, or appropriate within shifting contexts. No single standpoint, value, or criterion can permanently govern all others. Most forms of leadership fail because they measure one thing according to the standards of another, forcing things into externally imposed hierarchies of usefulness, meaning, and value. And this is why the inner chapters consistently praise adapting as a philosophy of action. Efficacy emerges from joining forces with tendencies that are already present within situations themselves. And this also means that the Zhuangzi leader is not independent in any ordinary sense. If anything, the leader is hyper-dependent because they depend on everything equally. without preference other than the one that emerges situationally and provisionally. Right? So this third practice critiques the absolutization of perspectives, and we can summarize it by saying that leadership consists in sustaining multiple relations among diverse beings without reducing them to a single order. Okay, so if we want to re-articulate this in a kind of a prescriptive manner, like how would you become an effective leader? How to do it, right? Which could be a very anti-Zhuangzi kind of formula, but I will say it anyway. First, do not try to lead. Second, empty yourself of anything rigid and fixed. And third, respond to multiplicity in non-reductionist ways, right? So now we turn on to the second questions. Do these figures is this discussion of leadership political, right? Okay. And the answer is yes, it is. If we approach the political in the way that Zhao Tingyan does, as the art of coexistentiality, as he says, the transformation of spaces of conflict and competition into worlds of shared coexistence. Or we can say, in a more dynamic way, worlds of shared co-becoming, right? So if that approach to the political holds, then the Zhuangzi and the inner chapters in particular, which is what I'm talking about, are political. But of course, we should still ask, well, if the leader is not leading somewhere, right, towards some kind of goal, and if the leader is not even grounded in an intention to want to lead, right, then how can we call this leadership at all? And I think that we can, if we stop assuming that leadership must come from a directing subject, an individual human center of control, with a plan for order, for purpose, for meaning, if we see leadership more as a field of mutual shaping, where influence arises through decentralized interactions and non-coercive transformation, rather than from a single source of authority. Because even without aiming at a fixed destination, these actions still reshape situations. They open some possibilities, they close others, they enable transformations. So the sort of social coordination doesn't come from imposing patterns or boundaries in advance, but from the patterns that emerge dynamically within forms of interaction itself, right? So I'm ending, thank you, Wendy, with this image of a riverbed, right? That is not an external structure imposed on water. Is the sedimented trace of water's own movement and interaction with the terrain over time, and yet it does channel the waters, right? So that would be the image of the Zhuangist leader. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. And now we will move to the two discussion stages. And Professor Fraser, would you like to respond to Professor Valmisa?
Okay. Thank you, Mercedes. I enjoyed that very much. And I think it should be obvious that if we focus on your big three suggestions, that do not try to lead,
empty yourself,
and then the multiplicity idea that I pretty much am going to deeply agree with all three of those. So my main response is concerns some of the rhetoric, and I think this is an interesting thing to talk about, because I think we have sort of a shared feel for what we're trying to describe here, and we kind of struggle in our language to delineate just what it is and to communicate what we think we're interpreting here. So 3 points. The first one, I would take issue with Zhao's conception of the political. I think that he's just describing the social, basically. So to me, the notion of the political, intrinsically is going to involve coercion and the use of political authority. And that I think is one reason why we're especially concerned with it, because we're especially concerned with the inappropriate application of authority. And of course, in ancient China, it's pretty obvious what's happening. People are being forced to do things that maybe aren't the right sorts of things for those people to be doing. All too often, because of the vision of a monarch who holds virtually absolute power. So I would emphasize the role of coercion and political authority in understanding the concept of the political here. A second point, and this kind of goes back to some questions Stephen was asking. Part of our challenge in working with the political content in the Zhuangzi, and for that matter, other preaching texts, is that they're all assuming a very rich sort of political context that doesn't exist anymore, right? So we're assuming a context where you've got a hierarchical monarch with a very high degree of authority. It's not absolute, but it's close to it, over a vast population, most of whom have no access to any communication technology except word of mouth, and most of whom are illiterate and do have a certain sort of settled way of life. And nobody doubts that political authority is justified. That's just sort of taken for granted. And so it's a context that's very, very far removed from our own. And so adapting what they say to our own is really quite a challenge. That's why I said, there's a book or two waiting to be written there. Okay, the third point, again, this is mainly a rhetorical issue. So if pushed, I wouldn't say that this ruler doesn't lead. There's some rhetoric by which we can say, no, they don't lead. They don't like set forward a path and make everybody follow them. But on the other hand, there is that sort of Taoist thing about lead by following, but it doesn't actually say you're not leading. So the ruler can perceive that there is a need going unfulfilled and see a path toward fulfilling it and very subtly guide people along that path without ever giving a command, for instance. Or for that matter, maybe in some cases they are going to give a command, but it's a command that people are ready to accept in a certain way. So rhetorically, I think there's quite a challenge to explaining exactly what they do. It's almost like they can lead, but it's a facilitative sort of leading rather than a coercive sort of leading, something like that. And of course, then we face this epistemic problem of pinning down how you could tell the difference between those sorts of things, which is not a trivial problem at all. And I think that this is an instance of a broader problem we have, in that we struggle to articulate, the most obvious example would be the concept of wu wei. We struggle to articulate what that is. And we see in the secondary literature lots of rhetoric referring to not intentionally doing something, or not deliberately doing it, or not doing it with effort, or not having a volition. And, in ancient Chinese conceptual vocabulary, there's no concept that corresponds to volition. There is one that corresponds to purpose. But the purposes in question, you can still act with a purpose as long as the purpose is not something that you've set up on your own. References to effort seem misplaced because you could act with a great deal of effort, yet nonetheless be wu wei. You could intentionally lead. It could be an intentional thing that you do, but you could still do it in this sort of facilitative, responsive way. And so, none of the terms in English that come naturally to people to try to describe what that is really fit the situation. We're struggling here to come up with a vocabulary by which to talk about this thing that we see in the texts. And for that matter, the original writers of the text struggled as well, because wu wei is a terrible term for it.
Yeah, so those are all great comments. So on your first point, if you disagree with that, if you think the political has to be coercive, that has to be in some kind of coercive force, then definitely the Zhuangzi would be anti-political in that definition of the political, anti-use of coercive force, right? But then we can also use the Zhuangzi's rhetoric and Taoist rhetoric in general and say, well, perhaps that's the conventional view of the political, right? And that's like what people think. But the great political, right? Like when we'll have that with Stephen's talk about the 5 greats, right? The great political is not political in the sense of not coercive. And that's where we can make a difference perhaps between the ruler and leaders right? Those leaders are not going to be coercive figures. They are not going to maybe even be like recognized as officially political figures, right? Like all this, like this parade of monsters in chapter 5 who are extremely influential, and they are leaders in the sense of having followers and shaping situations and circumstances and possibilities for people, and even like opening the imagination of what is possible, right? Like really transforming the world and leading ways without even trying, right? And those are like the type of leaders that are different from the politician, the ruler that is up there who has that kind of absolute power that no one even can, yes, can even like challenge their authority because it's part of those times, right? So I think in my reading, then the Zhuangzi is accepting that that's kind of, like that is the situation. We may have a ruler that is something that we cannot help. It cannot be avoided, right? But it can be balanced out and it can be survived, right? So we can have like an alternative way of navigating this reality, and we can understand this anti-political, that is the true political realm, in this way that is going to help us balance out the power of that ruler and have flourishing shared worlds of coexistence and co-becoming despite the ruler, right? That is not a Taoist ruler. That is like that ruler of full absolute coercive power, right? If that makes sense. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Walker, now the screen is yours for the 8 minutes discussion.
All right, thank you. So yeah, I have two questions, as I had before. Number one, we're going to call the motivation question. And here's what I mean by the motivation question. It seems like if one steeps in Zhuangzi and Zhuangzi adjacent discourse long enough, it can seem like any particular conviction a person might have, any particular ambition or set goal would be some kind of like it would degrade their ability to respond well instead of enhancing it. And I just want to sort of maybe not pick your brain, but at least get a sense of like how extreme you think the text stance is on the matter of specific goals or values working against effective agency instead of helping to facilitate effective agency. And the other question I have, let's call it the empirical question. And it's a question about how best to interpret these claims in the text. Basically, do you think that these guys think they are making an empirical claim about effective political leaders? Meaning, do they think they're making the kind of claim where if you were to actually study the careers of great governors and generals and functionaries of various kinds, you could actually verify this playing out? Because if they're making an empirical claim, it's going to be a challenge for them. It would be a challenge for anybody to get inside the heads of all of the most effective leaders of history. So it's a challenge on the best of days. But I think it's particularly a challenge for anybody interested in the idea that the way they achieved so much was precisely through something completely different from any of the ambitions they apparently had, or any of the goals that they apparently pursued, or values that they tried to promote. I'd be fascinated to hear anything you have to say about either or both of those topics.
All right. Yeah, I love those questions too. So the first question, actually, it's pretty much the one that I wanted to throw at you, like throw it back at you about that aspiration, because it's there is a paradox there as well, right? You cannot aspire to want something that you don't already know a little bit and value a little bit, right? That's the first thing. So it seems like you already need to have a certain degree of valuing the loosening of the attachment to fixed distinctions and so on in order to want to undergo a cultivation process that is gonna continue further loosening that attachment, right? But then if you have a goal or an intention that is set and that you're going to work for it, then again, that is going to undermine the obtaining of that intention in this case, right? So how do you go about that? I think like I think the way I view it is that it's not about cultivating towards a particular goal, but really it's an attitude that you have towards your own epistemic and doxastic attitudes, right? So instead of whenever you have a belief and you have a perception of the world, you make a judgment, right? Or you make an appreciation whenever you have any of those states, the mental states, then it's training to detach yourself a little bit from the immediacy and the urgency and the kind of like the transparency with which you leave that state as true, right? And then so training in that loosening of the attachment towards your mental states, that is not a fixed goal. It's kind of a dispositional training, right? It's kind of a training in skepticism, sort of. That I think could kind of solve the paradox that we are talking about. But like I'm saying, I'm gonna throw that question back at you because I also want to know what you think about that issue and about the motivational issue. But let me also address, if I have time, a little bit the empirical question. I find that a very fun and interesting question. The way I see it, there is a level of what you're saying, empirical basis on which the claims are made, both in the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi, that whenever something becomes too rigid, it creates friction and then undermines the goals that you wanted to and you intended to achieve, right? There is some evidence and some observation, right, of how things work in the social world and also in the natural world, right? But when it comes to like what you were saying, like observation of leaders and saying, okay, so good leaders have these features, that is not how I'm reading it, precisely because the leaders that are being presented as highly effective, they're like the most unlikely characters, right? That they are not really being promoted as official figures, having any kind of jobs or anything like that. So they're not like real people, right, with real jobs. So I take all those observations to be highly speculative and to be like the proposing of an alternative reality, let's say. So it's like, so we see the world this way, and we think it has to be this way, and we think things have to move in this direction. So I'm gonna give to you, like, open that imagination to an alternative in which things work differently, and they may even work better, right? And then at the same time, I think these three whatever practices of leadership, or like, they are not normative in any way, because that would be completely self-undermining, right? So in the person who does not intend to lead can end up having following and having that capacity, that magnetic interactions with others that help them become an influential figure, but they also may not, right? That is not intending to lead, is not going to turn you into a leader immediately, right? And also there are occasions in which, and there are situations in which you probably should intend to lead, right? So you cannot be fixated in any single, precept. Even not intending to lead probably needs to be violated in some context, right? And in some context, you may have to present yourself as more, more strongly, more authoritatively, or even like present those intentions to others if you want to make it work. So yeah, we have 1 minute, so I'll let you respond to that, Stephen.
Yeah, so thinking about what you're saying right now and swirling it together with certain things I'm thinking right now might yield the following attitude about the empirical question. Like, in the length and breadth of human history, some people are more effective leaders than others. The one thing we can say with a certain a priori confidence is that to whatever extent they were actually effective, it didn't have that much to do with their goals and their values or any such structures. It had to do with their softness. I think that's like it's a way of it's like a non-falsifiable generalization about how any leader must be working. Well, it has to be the softness, and therefore the if there is a normative upshot, it's always work on your softness. Getting softer will never hurt your prospects. What do you think about that?
I think it might hurt your prospect. I don't think that can be a Zhuangzi
I mean,
scale
do you
that.
think that they want to say that kind of thing, maybe?
No, I mean, I think that the authors of the Zhuangzi could never make that a principle to be followed under all circumstances and under all conditions and for all people forever. I think there are moments in which time is up, and then you sometimes you
There are
have
moments
to.
when time is up.
Sometimes you have to be strong, and sometimes you have to be soft. And softness might be more of like it's a counter value, so it needs to be emphasized more because people tend to want to be strong, right? And they think that's going to work for them. So they have to emphasize more that softness, but that does not mean that there are no moments in which being strong is not like the most effective thing to do. That's how I view it.
Shanzai.
Thank you, professors, for the insightful discussions. Maybe we can continue in later part, discussion part. And now let's welcome our third speaker, Professor Stephen Walker.
Yeah, let me just share what I want to share. Wait, I am having difficulty sharing my screen for some reason.
Oh, maybe you can like talk more.
It should
Well,
work, Stephen, if you just, yeah, give it a second maybe, but it's open for everyone to be able to share.
yeah. Well, here's what I'm gonna do. Can I like drop a PDF in the chat or something? Would that make it show up?
I can make you host
Or-
if you want, but normally it just anyone can just share. There's no permission.
I believe that. I can't account for what I'm seeing.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Why don't you put it in the chat? Maybe Wendy can help you go
Yeah,
through the
Yes, I can
slides or
share
stuff.
this.
Okay,
Yes,
Yeah,
I can.
so let me get 四海为学 presentation.pdf. I think I just I think I have just sent a PDF via the chat.
Yes, I received it.
Okay, now we can all look at it together. And this is my humble gift to all of you. So we're going to be talking about something called the Five Greats passage because it talks about five really great things. And if you follow along on page 1 of the PDF, it's transmitted in 2 compendia that we currently have. It's transmitted in Zhuangzi 2 and Huainanzi 14. These 2 texts are not identical word for word, but they're very close, and I think they resonate with each other well enough. Nice. Yeah, we can use nice. They're close enough to each other that I think they can pretty efficiently be interpreted together as expressing more or less the same philosophical message. As I say in one of my write-ups here, like so much else that we now think of as part of the Zhuangzi or part of the Huainanzi, I don't think the Five Greats passage is defined by the fact that it currently appears in this or that compendium. Like thousands of other pieces of lore in the early Chinese tradition, it's a piece of lore that is moved around and modified and appears in various forms. Somebody at some point in time saw fit to put it in Zhuangzi 2, and that has made it part of Zhuangzi 2 ever since. Somebody else presumably saw fit to put it in Huainanzi 14. What happens when we just look at it in and of itself, try to ascertain what its meaning is on a small scale? Now, because of the colossal importance and popularity of Zhuangzi 2, we almost always approach the Five Greats passage as part of Zhuangzi 2. And I think that leads to certain inevitable biases in what we think this passage is about or what it's doing or what's interesting about it. Dao and Bian, so something like the way and something like disputation, are 2 of the 5 topics. And Dao and Bian are, if anything, the principal topics of Zhuangzi 2. And so we 99% of the time probably look at this passage as interesting mainly for what it says about Dao and Bian, which is completely fair. That's probably why whoever put it in the Zhuangzi chose to put it in the Zhuangzi. But in and of itself, it talks about Dao and Bian and caring and integrity and courage with exactly the same emphasis. If we look at these 5 parallel statements by themselves, I think we could put them into a genre with a lot of other statements of Da X who X, or like the great version of such and such is not what you would expect. Up to and including the great version of such and such isn't even such and such. Mercedes was talking about great coercion is not coercion. That is a genre of aphoristic jab in early Chinese literary culture. So the text is rather difficult, and I'm glossing over several problems with the wording and the idiom. If we want to talk about them, we can, but I want to move on to the next page where we start looking at the statements about Tao. So this one's going to be easy. It's the simplest topic of all. Great Tao is not proclaimed. Variant, Great Tao has no form. And then the Zhuangzi version is longer. It has these additional follow-up statements after the declaration. Tao that is conspicuous does not serve as Tao. Unfortunately for us, we have to make short work of this because I want to talk about the moral stuff. But as I say here, I think a decent reading of this passage is, we're accustomed to recognizing something as Tao when it is conspicuous, Zhao, which entails that it has some determinate form, not no form, like in the Huainan version, which renders it the kind of thing that we do proclaim. But, says the writer, whoever that might be, the most impressive or all-encompassing Tao is none of those things. Thus, it truly serves as Tao. We may not recognize this, but that's our problem. We can't spend time with this, unfortunately, but it's familiar enough to a lot of you that you'll sort of know how to connect the dots and understand the kind of game being played here. Let's move on to topic number 2, bien. Now, bien is difficult to translate. I'm going to use this horribly awkward phrase, victory-oriented verbal distinction drawing, which I hope will satisfy Chris, among others, who have written a lot about what this concept means. Zhuangzi says, great bien is not spoken. Huainan's a variant. Great bien has no sound. Obviously, it can't be spoken if it doesn't sound like anything. And then the Zhuangzi follows up, speech that biens doesn't get somewhere. It doesn't say where it doesn't get. There's just something it doesn't reach or it doesn't attain to. Well, here's a parallel treatment to Tao. We're accustomed to recognize something as bien when it is a verbal performance, specifically a victory-oriented distinction drawing. But there is a more impressive or all-encompassing kind of bien. It's not verbal. We kind of have to guess here as to what that would be. I mean, maybe some kind of cognitive or practical grasp of distinctions, an ability to draw them efficaciously that proceeds on a non-verbal or pre-verbal level. Whatever it is, it's allegedly effective or reaches somewhere that spoken bien doesn't get. And if this violates our intuitions about what bien is, once again, that's our problem. As previously stated, Tao and bien may be the topic of the Qi Wulun, but they're only 2 out of the 5 topics of the 5 grades. So let's move on. I have ordered the remaining 3 not in textual order, but in order of difficulty. I think the one about courage is easy to understand. So easy to understand. Great courage is not harsh or aggressive. Huainan variant, great courage is not arrogant or boasting. Courage that is harsh and aggressive does not attain completion. When we think about harsh or aggressive or arrogant or boasting kinds of people, we may grant that they can be brave, they can be courageous, but for the rhetoric of this material, they're courageous in kind of a crappy, ordinary way. Brutality and self-aggrandizement are certainly not deal breakers if all a person needs to do is rush into the fray or complete some dangerous physical task. But there is a most impressive form of bravery, a most all-encompassing form of bravery that doesn't look like that at all. If anything, great bravery is gentle. Great bravery is humble, at least by comparison with petty bravery. To speculate, especially given the Huainan connection, we should probably be thinking of the kind of bravery exercised by people with a lot of responsibility, like highly placed people who need to take care of large numbers of people and engage in very complex, dangerous operations, as opposed to the physical challenges confronting a person who can be brave in the straightforward sense. It is speculative, though. We tend not to recognize this greatest courage as courage. That's not speculative. They're committed to that. And what that means is we can't really appreciate the most brave people in the world. That's a problem. What about integrity? Now, this one's really nice. The grayed out character is susceptible of multiple interpretations. I'm a little bit less confident when I say humble is the best rendering of this, but I'm somewhat confident. So great integrity is not humble. Now, integrity is not a perfect one-to-one translation for the end, but it's pretty close. Incorruptibility is pretty good too, which is why it's so surprising. Integrity that is pure is not trusted. So let's think about a person who has pure integrity and is obviously incorruptible in the sense that we all think of. That person would never take a bribe. They would never exploit people unfairly. They would never try to wield power that they're not entitled to wield or not competent to wield. Unfortunately for us, though, the text is telling us that's a kind of crappy, ordinary form of integrity or incorruptibility. The most impressive kind isn't like that at all. I think what that means is the most impressive kind would have to be at some level, accommodating toward the impure, accommodating toward corruption. There's going to be a certain kind of comfort with lack of integrity. And we're informed these are the people we actually trust in the first place. So we have a certain kind of image of the kind of person we trust where they have pure integrity, but it doesn't match actuality, where the people we actually trust they have incorruptibility in a deeper, stranger way that involves being comfortable with corruption. Truly trustworthy people don't care about being trustworthy. If they did, relying on them would be a worse idea, not a better one. And once again, we have trouble recognizing this, but that's our problem. Following up and completing with the most directly paradoxical of all, da ren, bu ren, direct self-contradiction. I mean, we all know Tian Di Bu Ren from the Tao Te Ching. We know we can understand Da Ren Wu Qin, the Huainanzi variant. Great caring has no specific affections, but it's a very bald self-contradiction of a pointed kind in the Zhuangzi version. And it says caring that is constant does not attain completion. There is an important textual variant with Zhou instead of Cheng. So caring that is constant is not all-encompassing somehow. So let's think about a super caring person in the ordinary sense. That person is loving, they have a lot of affection, they care about caring. You know, it's all crappy. It's fine. It's not very impressive, though, for whoever is responsible for these lines. There's a more impressive kind of caring, a more all-encompassing kind of caring that doesn't sound like that or feel like that or look like that at all. It doesn't care about caring, doesn't have anything like we would recognize as specific attachments or loves, and is comfortable with uncaring in the way that a truly incorruptible person is comfortable with corruption. Hence, you can see my conclusion lurking at the bottom of the page now. A truly benevolent person cannot be defined by their benevolence. They're accommodating toward unbenevolence, hence the ability not to care, or even the ability to want to destroy. When caring really attains completion, the reasoning seems to go, when caring really attains completion, which probably means when it can really carry out great ventures or benefit huge numbers of people, the people doing that aren't caring in a recognizable street sense. And if we don't recognize what they're doing as caring, it is once again a problem we have to overcome by understanding the pettiness or the alleged pettiness or shallowness of the ways in which we typically size people up and classify them. I guess I don't have time to say anything substantive beyond that, so I'll just tell you to read the Huainans. And I look forward to exchanges with my friends.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for your wonderful talk. And now let's welcome Professor Fraser to give some comments.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So in a way, this little five greats paragraph is like a compact expression of a core Zhuangist stance on what it's all about in guiding action in life. It's funny because none of those very, very directly touches on a political subject, but I put a comment in the chat box, and you could easily see the paragraph being expanded by one line or one of the words being swapped out, so that you might have an equivalent dealing with the word "zhi," to put in control or put in order. And I think that in political contexts, in the background, the underlying concern is always this idea of "zhi." So basically what's going on is they're saying something along the lines of "da zhi bu zhi." Great governing or great control doesn't control. And so by way of a question, I invite you to modify the fourth word in that if you want to, or to speculate on what the second part of the couplet would be, if there were one that began with 大智不智. Okay, so when I said that the Five Greats passage is kind of this capsule summary of a Zhuangist approach to, how you do it. It's really nice that way because, of course, it starts with Dao, and you're absolutely right that throughout Qi Lun, Dao and Bian or Dao and Yan are these core concepts. And why are they considered so important? Because the text wants to critique prevailing conceptions of what Dao is and how you follow it, right? And one of those conceptions, the Maoist conception, and to some extent the Xunzian conception, is you follow it out by you laying it out in speech, what the guidelines are for following Dao. And of course, this passage wants to say, no, it doesn't work that way. As soon as you make it explicit, it doesn't guide anymore. Once you make it explicit, it's not the kind of Dao that we actually need to rely on. And the same goes with speech. Once you actually draw the distinctions in speech, they don't extend to every case, or they're unable to guide us in every case. And then the same for the other virtues. Now, you were asking me if I thought the people writing the political stuff thought of themselves as Ren, and I know you had this line in mind. So I think it's typical here that in this passage, they're not rejecting the prevailing norms and the ends associated with prevailing norms and values. If it's something like, well, should we care about other people? The Zhuangist writers are not going to say, no, we shouldn't care about other people. But they're going to say that, really attaining what it is we're after through this ideal of caring about other people can't be attained by aiming at caring and taking that as a means of modeling yourself or modeling your path of action, based on some explicit or prevailing conception of what caring is. Instead, it's going to be much more contextual, and it's not going to involve aiming at that thing made into some sort of explicit end. So that's just some general comments about that particular passage, which you can respond to as you wish. I didn't totally get the Huainanzi message. I mean, the message was read the Huainanzi. Is that it? Because what I think you do by taking out those passages and putting them side by side is it's a very helpful reminder that if we're interested in Zhuangzi, we really should be studying Huainanzi in parallel. No one has solved, and I'm not sure we can solve the mystery of the relation between the Huainanzi and the Zhuangzi, except to say it's utterly fascinating. I know that people who are specialists on this have pointed out 200 to 300 different places where the Huainanzi is reusing Zhuangzi material, and I myself suspect that there might even be more. And the Huainanzi doesn't give us an authoritative reading of what the Zhuangzi writers were after, but it does give us another version of the material written by people a little bit later who are very, very interested in it, who are modifying it slightly to their own ends. And in terms of the broader context of understanding that material, it really, really, is important for us to be looking at both of these sources in parallel. I agree with that.
Nice. So Wendy, how much time do I have?
You still have 3 minutes.
Sweet. Well, I can devote one each to the topics of Ren, Lian, and Dao, the three obviously political topics in the Five Greats. I won't do it in a rigorous way, though. So maybe people have different associations with words like politics and government and leadership. But I think that if we're looking for a sense of what the political could defensively be taken to be in classical Chinese culture, I'm almost uncomfortable talking about politics. I'm comfortable talking about governance, not even government, but governance, like the act of governing, which is done by people who have certain qualities and certain positions.
Yeah.
And what that means is that virtue terms like Ren and Yi are inherently governmental because they're almost always talked about in the context of what will follow from a person having or properly exercising Ren Yi or failing to do so in social and organizational and institutional terms.
Sure.
And so, yeah, there's no direct reference to coercion or imperial title and ranks and things like that. However, anybody in that kind of picture is going to be really concerned with Ren and Lian and Dao. And so I think this little movable bit of lore will be intensely interesting to anybody in a political culture, precisely because it says there's a much grander version of each of these virtues that people don't understand 99% of the time. Maybe if they thought about things carefully enough, they could come to understand what, I don't want to say like real Tao looks like. Real and unreal, that's a problem. But like the grandest, most vast sense of Tao, where it doesn't really match any of their intuitions about Tao that they have in their ordinary life, where it's always determinate in some way. When it comes to Lian and Ren, it's completely fascinating to me that we can look at governmental decisions that appear cruel or callous and suspend judgment about whether they're cruel or callous. Not that the text is telling us that we should, but it's telling us that we can and how to do it. Um, and I want to circle back to something you said in your response to my response some time ago. I forget the exact phrasing you used, but you used this motif of not taking something as guidance. And I think that whoever's responsible for the five greats and like putting it in these two texts, I think they'd really agree with the idea that, well, whatever Ren and Lian and Dao and so on are, they're not available for guidance, at least not in the grandest terms that a person who exercises the most social influence will be doing them or engaging them at. So yes, thanks as ever.
Professor Fraser, you can give a quick response, or we can directly move on to Professor Valmisa.
It's better if we move on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome, Professor.
All right, so let's continue what you were just saying. So these great, excellent virtues, let's call them, or ways of doing things, they are not up to becoming a guide, right? They cannot become guidance. But do you think or not that this passage in particular and similar passages that seem to be giving indications on how to do certain things, not to do them in this way, but do them in this other way, that is the counterintuitive way, that is the non-conventional way, the opposite of what we expect, blah, blah, blah. Are they trying to give guidance really? And are they normative? Are they prescriptive? And do they think that it always works, right? That's continuing both the conversation you were having with Chris and the one that we were having earlier. So that would be the first part of my question. What is your view on that? And then also, so you're presenting these excellent things, right? And people don't have really role models on which to see those, right? Because when you see leaders, they're doing the petty kind of integrity and courage and this and that, right? It's not, this is the other kind that you can only talk about or imagine, but you don't see in your ordinary life represented by people in your community. So you don't have role models for this. So where is, back to that question, where is your motivation, not in the sense of wanting to do it, but where does the very aspiration to act in that way or to become that kind of person come from? Where is the inspiration, and then both inspiration and aspiration, right? Does it come from teacher who's telling you, hey, if you want to be a great leader, don't be fooled. It's not like that. It's actually like this. So is it someone teaching you how to become that great Taoist leader that is going to take over the world, right? By doing everything opposite to how ordinary people do? Or where does it come from? Or are we just relying on luck, on contingency, on like, oh, there are people who simply are born like that. You know, that's how they act. No one has taught them. They didn't have to cultivate or train themselves in any way. They just happen to be like that. You know, I think we see examples of that kind of figure. They just happen to be like that in the transit, right? So are we going to rely on these figures to find that kind of behavior that can be like great in different ways? Or is there a cultivation program, and is there some kind of like trying to get people into this kind of program. What is your view on that?
We should talk for the next 2 hours, but we can't. What a great conversation starter. So I typed short little answers to some of your concerns that I will now put in the chat so everybody can see them. Of course, memory being what it is, I now don't perfectly remember why I wrote these specific things, but I'm sure it connects in some way to what you were saying. So you were asking about, I think one thing you were asking about was, what kind of practical advice could the five grades passage give to anybody? Like, assuming that they care about attaining these great versions of the virtues, like, what are they being told to do? And I think it's like, don't be taken in by the small versions of them. Like, don't be overly impressed. So, like, let's say that somebody proclaims the Tao really confidently, and everybody agrees that that's the right way to do things. Just don't be impressed. I think that is a kind of practice. Like the practice, maybe one could call it a skeptical practice. Um, when people praise somebody's Ren, when it's obvious how loving and caring and benevolent they are, just be ready for the opposite to be true and don't think that they provide any kind of guidance. It's a bunch of kind of negative or withholding attitudes, maybe, about those sorts of things. And if that is a kind of mental discipline or a kind of mental reminder system one can give oneself, I want to move to another thing you brought up, which was the question of motivation. Um, I think a reasonable way to understand why somebody would be motivated to undertake those practices is that they've had bad experiences with the petty versions of those virtues.
Hmm.
So this is obviously I've obviously opened up a vast topic by talking about this, but a lot of people have had experiences feeling betrayed or hoodwinked or misled by virtuous people, by people who are not sham virtuous, but who are perhaps virtuous in an ordinary or easily understandable way, rather than the deeper ways that some people who are less famous for it are virtuous. A person can really invest in explicit, confident, brilliant models of the right way to live, Tao, the right way to do things, and realize it was empty, at least in that particular form that was being affirmed so confidently. And I think that that's personally where my motivation comes from for being interested in this passage. And that may have been the case in the culture that produced it too. A sort of readiness to no longer take certain things at face value or quite so seriously as we're accustomed to. Um, as far as another of the 25 questions you raised that I want to address but can't, you were raising questions about where good leaders come from, or like what we're supposed to trust as a process that gives us worthwhile people worth trusting and, promoting and things like that. And I think an answer that the Zhuangzi and the Huainanzi would, they're like this. I think an answer that the Zhuangzi and the Huainanzi would agree to is, who knows? There is no ultimate explanation for why anything happens. I mean, everything is ultimately, like Zipporah says, like local coherence, global incoherence. And so like the more you zoom out and try to account for why particular people wound up doing the particular things they did, the less of an answer you're going to have, which is, a very secularized and abstract version of the concept of Ming or fate. I think they could say fate, which is like 不知其所以然而然. Nobody knows why this is happening. I may have strayed somewhat from the intent of your questions, though. So hopefully we have time for back and forth.
Okay. Let me just pick up one of the things you said about the motivation. So imagine I trust someone who seems to be really trustworthy and caring, and then this person fails at, or a person who proclaims themselves to be, right, or is famous for being caring and trustworthy, and then in their interactions with me, they fail to be, right? They fall short. I don't know that my immediate reaction could be to distrust integrity or trustworthiness or honesty itself, but would be like, that person sucks, right? They fail to meet the standard for good behavior, right? And so I would then distrust this individual and not the concept of honesty or care or integrity itself, right? I would then be like, well, then everyone should be immoral then, and it does not matter anymore whether they are caring or uncaring with me. I would be like, this person, this individual sucks, and they are proclaiming they're hypocritical, they're proclaiming to be something that they are not. That makes sense?
So I think that rhetorical form, da x bu x, takes both of the crossroads at the same time. It actually does both of what you're saying because like a Dao Ren person is Ren. It's just that they're not Ren in the petty sense. Like it's not about losing
Of
faith
always being Ren.
in the
Sometimes they're
public.
not.
Like say again?
So they are not, the petty sense is when you're always Ren, you always, like with being caring, you're always caring. You have so much care for everything, right? And for everyone. So the being like really Ren or the Da Ren then could be like sometimes you are not caring, right?
Exactly. Well, you're not caring in the petty sense. So if you look at these, if you scroll back on your personal copies of the PDF and look at all these things, like Dao Jiao or Bu Dao, Yan Bian or Bu Qi, like what the petty forms have in common is obviousness, I think. So like Dao is brilliant, speech is actually, speaking forth the disputation instead of somebody just thinking it. There's like violent, brash courage. There's a completely incorruptible person. It's the obviousness that I think these guys are nervous about. And so again, one way of trying to take the crossroads that you're talking about is that when a person is benevolent or caring or has a lot of integrity and also turns out to be very disappointing or to betray your expectations in some way, it's simply that you were taken in by the obvious aspects of what they were doing and weren't paying attention to the less obvious ones. Or maybe the less obvious things that other people you're not paying attention to are doing.
Yep.
And
I
we're
agree.
at
Yeah.
nice. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for the wonderful discussions. Now let's open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, please, you can text it in the chat box or directly open your mic.
I have a question for Chris. Thanks so much for all three of you for this really scintillating discussion. And I'm sorry, my brain is kind of mush. It's really late and I'm really tired. Also, I'll try to verbalize this. I was struck by what you said about the ruler not having a Tao, and unlike other actors who are interacting according to kinds of more natural propensities and things like that. So if you take the skills stories as kind of illuminating in terms of the roles we play or the skills we acquire, the things we do to just fulfill basic life functions, right? I mean, isn't the role and responsibility of a ruler also similar in that they're playing out something, they're achieving something, they potentially very great if they do it in the right way, in this kind of way fashion. And so oftentimes even in the Lao Tzu you see I mean, it's such an ironic text, kind of political advice when you can't give, when they're trying to kind of divest politics from the ruler, but there's a sense of kind of activating, the ruler is there to activate and allow, all the people to kind of flourish in their own ways. And so I was just wondering if you still want to stick by that whole there is no Tao of the ruler, because to me that is sort of kind of it's the role of the ruler, just as the butcher is trying to carve the ox. It's not like he's blindly, running into an ox and all of a sudden it's carved. He has a kind of there's still motive behind all of these actions. There's a certain kind of motive, but it's just what is motivating is and how it motivates is kind of different. So I wanted to just hear what you would have to say about that.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I think, yeah, it's worth trying to tweak the phrasing a bit. So I can tell you what I'm trying to get at. and maybe I didn't get at it all that well, but we can work toward articulating it in a better way. So on the one hand, and I think this converges with what you were saying, when Stephen and Mercedes were talking about motivation of a leadership figure, I was thinking, well, there's a sense in which motivation just doesn't matter because they're born into a social role and they need to fill that social role. And only in very exceptional circumstances can they, abrogate the social role and flee or something like that. But most of the time, they're just stuck there, right? So there's a sense in which their self is associated with the social role and they have to perform that role. And of course, just as a father and a child have a certain social role with a Tao attached to that role, the ruler has a Tao attached to the role of being the ruler, okay? And the ruler has a job to do. So in that sense, there's a Tao. When I said that the ruler kind of doesn't have a Tao, what I had in mind was the idea that in interacting with the people, according to these Zhuangzi texts, the ruler is supposed to almost wholly subsume their personality into that role, such that there's really nothing left over. So generally speaking, in personal interaction in the Zhuangzi, I think the idea is that the monkey keeper and the monkeys, both have some path they want to follow, and they've got to negotiate a way to follow both of them at once. The monkey keeper doesn't wholly subsume himself into fulfilling the Tao of the monkeys. But the Tao of the ruler, very importantly, seems directed at, guiding, enhancing, facilitating the good of the people in a way that isn't reciprocated by the other side. So that's why I wanted to try to draw a distinction between the public-facing role of the ruler and the person's role as a self. And all this is a bit speculative. So I want to think about it more to see how it works out. But the idea is that in your role as a ruler, you're not thinking about your path. You're thinking about the path of the community, basically. And in that respect, you don't have your own Tao. You only have this ruler Tao.
Thank you. But when in any instance of Wu Wei, do you ever follow the self, the path of the self? I would argue, I wonder if it's not just that every single human being in some sense has to transcend and kind of join in with a kind of larger the relationality and all of that of the environment and the Tao, the intrinsic Taos of the emerging situation, I think as probably Mercedes would say. I don't know. I don't want to put words into anyone's mouth.
Right. So that's my point, that I think there's a distinction. So appropriate action or good Tao following or Tao following that manifests for everybody else includes some sort of responsiveness to the context. But in the case of the ruler, that seems a special case where you're no longer really pursuing any ends of the self at all. And then in the other cases, there's a kind of balancing between the two sides. So that's my proposal for discussion, that the ruler is a special case, although all of them are responsive in some way.
Okay, thank you. Professor Valmisa, would you like to respond to the audience?
Just raise a follow-up question for Chris as well. So imagine that we have a community in which some people are oppressed and other people are actively oppressing them and benefiting from that situation. Then the ruler comes in as the ruler managing these people. He cannot have any goal of improving the situation for the people who are oppressed, right? So his role would be just to continue fostering the conditions of these people, these particular communities, Tao, right? Which is to, those conditions that we have described. Do you agree with that? That could be what that Taoist leader would do?
Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So this comes up in a lot of my course discussions, to tell you the truth. So suppose you have a scenario in which some group is, by your standards in mind, some group is oppressed, and yet they have been so thoroughly brainwashed that they are absolutely convinced that they are not oppressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what does the Taoist leader do in a case like that? And I tend to think that whenever some group is oppressed, even if they have been brainwashed, there's still some hint there of dissatisfaction, that they might be better off. But it seems to me that it's against the Zhuangist outlook for someone to say, here is an oppressed group, I shall go and save them.
But if you see in terms not of groups but of individuals, going back to chapter 5, you have like these figures who are like they're marginalized because of their previous actions, and now they're perceived as being criminals or being like like socially like trash, right? And they want to transform their conditions. They want to effect some kind of change within that situation that they inhabit and they participate in, so that they are not perceived that way, right? Precisely, and they're acting against, right? So there is a resistance, and there is a complaining, and there is a like I talking about it, and a shaming Confucius, right, for saying certain things and acting in certain ways. So don't you think, for me, those figures are leadership figures, not political in the sense of they're not ruling over people, but they're leaders, right? They're social leaders, if you want to put it that way. And don't you think that like a Taoist or a Zhuangist ruler would also want to like transform situations to help emerge like new paths of harmonizing, as opposed to just like going along whatever is the status quo in a certain place?
Sure. So the scenario you're describing is one in which things are 不通, they don't flow smoothly, right? There are obstacles, there are frictions, there are clashes, and so
Yeah.
I think that the Zhuangist outlook would be for the astute ruler in a case like that to see that there was a clash of some kind and change subtly modify something to resolve that. Yeah. But assuming a scenario in which there weren't clashes like that, then I don't think they would interfere. So there's this very fine line between what would count as resolving oppression and interference.
I got it. Yeah, thanks.
Professor Walker, would you like to join?
I would. So a follow-up to what Mercedes was talking about, and also directed at Chris, and bouncing off of something we talked about an hour ago or whenever it was. Chris, you've mentioned that certain aspects of the Zhuangist political outlook seem to rely on there being a certain political culture in place, as any political outlook would. And we talked a bit about monarchy and heredity and all that. And I just want you to say more about that. I'm very, very curious about this. So, what do you say about the following? Like, would you make some kind of argument like Zhuangist political intuitions or intuitions about how leadership expresses itself presuppose a social reality wherein there is an aristocratic and or sacred basis for leadership? And that if it really does involve sacred and or aristocratic ambiance, then the reason it's not available to us anymore is French Revolution, collapse of the Qing dynasty, things on that level. Like, tell me what's on your mind in this area.
Okay. The writers of the text themselves need not buy into the idea that that's sacred, can't, a duty to the ancestors or what have you, that you can't tamper with that. All they need to do is recognize that it's widely perceived that way by other people, right? So if we think of the story of Meng Sun Cai, the guy who mounted the somewhat lavish funeral for his mother, right? He doesn't need the funeral, but he perceives himself to be in a social setting in which he really has to do that to make things work for other people. So to me, that brings us to the second story in Renjian Shi, the one about Shi Gongzi Gao. The one that says that these political and kinship relations you have are 不得已. They're just there. You can't do anything about it. And I think kind of a systematic problem that we have in reading old texts is that we tend to have an anachronistic understanding of the social and political setting. One way of kind of working working your way out of that understanding is to read the book Pre-Industrial Societies by Patricia Crone. So, we need to remind ourselves that as parts of the Zhuangzi say, there is no society you can go to in which you don't have this political hierarchy. And the hierarchy might not involve what you and I think of as the state. Maybe they don't really have an abstract conception of the state. Maybe we're better off just referring to it as a rulership or power hierarchy. But remember, text after Chinese text reminds us that the people writing these texts take that to be as inevitable and natural as the parent-child hierarchy, right? They tell us that again and again. And so that's just a given. So you're born into a certain role in the structure. And how do you cope with the role? That's what I see as the background.
So just to follow up, it's not that there's anything specific about the basis of rulership or the ideology of rulership that's essential to how the Zhuangists see politics. It more has to do with the fact that in warring states China, as in almost all times and places, the vast majority of social realities are budai, and everyone knows it, or at least a lot of people acknowledge it readily.
Yeah. And there aren't alternatives. I mean, you can run off and live in the woods, and a few people do that, but by and large, it's very difficult. And even if you run off and live in the woods, maybe the local lord will send the soldiers after you. You never know. So it's just there, and we need to deal with it. And so that's one reason I think that they don't really, they don't really address questions of the legitimacy of rule, for instance, except by tying it to effectiveness. So a ruler who's extremely ineffective and causes the people to starve will lose heaven's mandate or what have you. But that's not really their core issue, right? And so as Mercedes was saying, what's their core issue? Okay, you've got the power. What are you supposed to do with it? How? Right? It's not the justification, it's the how.
You've got the power. What are you going to do with it? That's interesting just to sort of reverberate as a starting attitude that they have.
Well, and then in Renjian Shi, in book 4 of the Zhuangzi, you get two passages saying this horrible person has the power. Is there anything we can do to try to mitigate that? And the funny thing is that you were talking about conventional values and the Zhuangist outlook. The fact that those two stories are included in the corpus, both of those stories, you've got someone who themselves is not in any personal danger, contemplating how they're going to put themselves in personal danger for the sake of the welfare of other people who they don't even know. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I could ask more questions, but I want to let other people have lots of
I
opportunities.
want to.
Yeah, let's wait for some minutes, and if there is. Maybe Professor Walker, you can continue your discussion.
So let's talk about the concept of legitimacy, political legitimacy. Chris, you've mentioned a couple of times, I may already be misremembering what you said, but something like, that's why they're not concerned about legitimacy. Is it something like, at least among the Zhuangists, and maybe we could generalize to a lot of early Chinese thinkers, there isn't a conversation about the general principles according to which somebody ought to be in a particular position. It's just not something that's on the table for people to make theories about.
Yeah, or why political authority should exist.
Right.
Right. So when we talk about questions of legitimacy, typically there are those two sides. So one is, why is this particular leader, why does that person qualify to have political authority? The other is, why should there be political authority in the first place? And so that's why, I think most of the Zhuangzi is not anarchist. I know some people want to read Taoism as a brand of anarchism, but in many, many passages in Taoist writings, it's just an assumption that the political hierarchy will exist. And then where do we go from there? I think there are a few passages that suggest, give us a vision of the world in which maybe there is no political hierarchy, but the majority of them assume there will be. And of course, there's that very haunting passage about, in the 智者之士, in the ideal world of virtue, the leadership are like the branches of a tall tree. So they're up there blowing in the wind. Apparently, they don't do very much. They don't interfere, but they still exist. It's like that structure is still there. Yeah. Well, if I can shift direction very slightly, so both Stephen and Mercedes mentioned the issue of motivation, and Stephen, I think, mentioned this thing about, well, is there some empirical ground for the claims that they're making, right? And in that regard, I think that second section in Ying Di Wang, section 7.2, is really quite revealing. In that, I mean, what's going on there? First, going back to your 5 grades passage, it starts off by citing what's a pretty conventional conception of good rulership, and then says that is 气德, it's fake 德. So you were talking about petty, or virtues that aren't worthy of respect as virtues because that's not the real one. So it says something like that, right? And then it goes on to say what having real virtue lies in. It says just be able to do the job. And then it hints at an empirical basis for doing things the other way, right? It seems to hint that if you do things the conventional way, that's like trying to perform these impossible tasks. So empirically, you're going to fail. So it's intriguing. That's a very short passage, but it kind of touches on 3 different issues that have come up in this conversation in a very compact way. And in effect is suggesting that the mainstream conception of governance at that time is one that is unlikely to be empirically effective.
So the question for people like us in a much later age is, what do we make of this as an empirical claim in the sense of a historical claim? Because, I mean, one thing that really ties early Chinese philosophical culture together is the pantheon of noteworthy leaders, both good and bad, that everybody has an opinion about, and everybody has their own analysis to give. In any time and place, people probably have a comparable pantheon. Like, as citizens of a global world, our pantheon is bigger and more controversial than ever. And so just to talk about what it's like to spend time with a lot of ancient Chinese texts, I find they're way overconfident in their interpretations of historical figures for the most part. I don't buy 95% of the opinions that they make about all of those men, because I think those men are just being trotted out as little levers in a conversation.
They're manufacturing the past to support what they already want to say. Yeah.
Which would mean they're not really engaging in an empirical inquiry.
No.
I mean, hypothetically, if this is an empirical claim, then historians and sociologists and so on could actually provide us with evidence one way or another about whether effective leaders do this Zhuangzi-like stuff or not. Which is why I'm sort of drawn to the idea that, like, it's actually an a priori claim about, like, and this is very much, I'm thinking out loud, they're inviting us to look at any leaders we want, including, leaders who did extremely violent or self-aggrandizing things, warlords, etc. And I think what they're saying is, well, to whatever extent that person was able to act well, adeptly, productively, and so on, it must be because of the stuff we're talking about, because of some kind of responsiveness. Like, we apparently have 1 minute, so take it away.
So there could be sort of a thin empirical background to that, and that is this. Sometimes when you're reading Zhuangzi material, think of it as protest literature. They're heartbroken, they're angry, they're upset at how things actually work today, in their time. And there's that wonderful passage about how, the people of today, everywhere you look, you see the punished people piled up against each other. So there is a kind of concern with how they, the breakdown of society as they perceive it. So whatever we're doing now doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, so take it less seriously, like you take Ren less seriously and courage less seriously, at least in any form that people today recognize.
Mm.
Thank you, professors, for all the wonderful talks and presentations. Yeah, now we're coming to the end of our today's event. Professor Paul, do you have anything to say or comment?